So this one is assessment, or standard 6, assessments. And I did a lesson that kind of had 2 parts. 3 parts really. The first part, it was about the 5 senses. So the first part, I did a review of the 5 senses, which they have studied. So it was kind of like a pre-assessment to make sure that they still remembered what we had studied. After that, we started talking about how we can use the 5 senses with specific things. So whether you can see it, can't see it, can hear it, can't hear it, which was the main point of the lesson. Then introducing some new vocabulary and kind of making sure they were tracking the vocabulary. Then putting those ideas together, the new vocabulary and how we use the 5 senses on individual objects together, was basically the end result. And the goal for me was that they could individually tell me whether they could hear, taste, smell, see, and touch novel things. So not just the vocabulary we were working with.
Right.
It was basically how the lesson broke down. The first one was the accommodations and assessments, which was tough because we don't have any kids with disabilities. And it's a small class, but most of our kids, all of our kids, are English language learners.
Right.
So I tried to make sure that everything we were doing, every step of the way, that we had all of our language really well modeled, that when we were looking at new vocabulary, that we drilled it and practiced it and reviewed it, just to make sure that if kids were making mistakes during my assessments, that if they were making mistakes, that they were mistakes in understanding the concept, not mistakes because they couldn't use the language.
Right.
So I wanted to try to make sure they had plenty of chances for modeled language and practice before I would assess them.
I would say for this one, but they're both disabilities, and we have no children with disabilities. I'd say outstanding, because you're right. You didn't just focus on the language that itself, and that wasn't the whole key point of it. It was understanding what were the 5 senses all about. But you did incorporate using full sentences, and you introduced the vocabulary first to them, and you did a little practice game with them with using the full sentence. And I saw you doing a lot of you focused on the 5 senses, but you were focusing on having them, use the proper way of saying the sentences. Like you had some positive and negative responses sometimes where they would take out the nose. Do you eat a tree with your nose or something like that?
Yeah.
That wasn't one, but. And they couldn't just say no, and they say you can't. So you emphasized that whole negative response as well. I say outstanding because you gave them a number of ways of using the language, but also focused your attention on not the language itself, but on the 5 senses.
The concept under the language.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think instead of, tailoring the assessments to different language abilities, I tried to make sure it was a lesson that made sure all the kids had an equal level of linguistic ability to complete the same assessment, if that makes sense. The next one was multiple assessments appropriately to gauge student learning. So the way I kind of broke this down when I was thinking about it was first with their kind of pre-assessment. That stuff was easy, just seeing if they remembered individually what the 5 senses were, and I gave them all chances to answer those questions. But my kind of summative on do they understand what the 5 senses are was giving them, like, playing a game where they'd have mismatched senses, we see with our ears. For me, if they can identify the mistake there and tell me the correct answer, it's almost more demonstrative of what they understand than if you just show them ears and they say we hear with our ears. It actually shows that they're thinking deeply and critically about it. So that was for that assessment. The other ones, I tried to give every kid a chance and give them feedback. If they seemed like they were struggling on their first one, I would come back to them. But I did do pretty much all of these assessments on the mat kind of as mini games. Because for these kids, games do seem to work the best. If they're engaged, they produce better work sometimes than if they're just doing a worksheet.
Right.
Kind of tailoring the lesson to different kids and their ability levels.
Oh, okay. So I think you did that then with all the different games and stuff that you did with them, because you played multiple games with them.
Yeah, and again, I think making it into games helps with the differentiation, because for a lot of our kids, it's more motivation can skew assessments a lot. They might have the ability, but just not be very interested in what we're doing.
And you kept it interesting, I think, with you, because you did keep their attention with funny examples, like touch your eye to check if something's hot, to check for hot coffee or something like that. And obviously you got a lot of responses from that. They laughed, and they understood why you wouldn't do that, and they could explain also.
Yeah.
So I think you were using individual, or you were using different tactics to catch each one of their attentions, whether they were the ones that weren't just not motivated with the lesson at that moment, and then you'd catch them from there to when you would move on to other games. So I'd say outstanding again. You used lots of different games for them to catch on to this game.
Great. Yeah, the one too with the summative, as far as doing the final summative assessment at the table, kind of having, they had 2 vocabulary words that they had gone over together on the mat, so they'd reviewed what they were expected to do. And the next step was the other 2 vocabulary words, filling in what you can and what sense you can and cannot use with it. But then having their final summative be, they had to fill in blanks with their own vocabulary, their own picture, and come up on their own with what senses you can and cannot use with it. So it means that, at that point, they can't just be remembering what we talked about.
Right.
They have to actually be showing that they understand the concept. So that was what I was going for there. The next was substantive and timely feedback to students on their work. So in this case, I think all the feedback was incredibly fast because it was immediate. It was just, giving kids support when they were correct. And if they were incorrect, telling them were incorrect, coming back to them and making sure that they all got to the point where they were answering correctly. But, using not just me praising them, but having the whole class applaud, or working at the table, taking that as a chance to kind of talk individually with each kid and give them feedback. And talk about maybe why they were making a mistake. Like, are you sure? Can you really hear that? Can you really hear it? So if they're making mistakes, talking through where their mistakes were when we're at the table, but also on the mat, trying to just support them for correct answers.
Yeah, because you really set them up for success on this one. I mean, and you're right. You introduced all that stuff to them, and at the end with your summative assessment, they could go back, do 2 examples with you to use kind of a memorization way, but then you had them use their own 2 ideas at the end, and you were able to check it right there immediately. I'd say outstanding.
Yeah, because at least if they were having a little bit of trouble...
And you left plenty of time, too, to work with them on that.
Yeah. But being able to come in and talk about mistakes as opposed to just, and these kids, if we talked about it later, like the next day, they wouldn't remember anything.
Right.
The next was aligning assessments with learning objectives. So, to my mind, the real objectives of this lesson wasn't really the vocabulary as much as it was a review of the 5 senses. So do they remember what the 5 senses are? And also, can they apply the 5 senses to a variety of objects and identify what senses we can and cannot use with them? So for both of those, like the pre-assessment, the summative pre-assessment, we talked about like trying to identify mistakes as being maybe a little bit more like deeper thinking and deeper learning than if they were just, we hear with our ears. So I hope that worked and kind of reduced bias, because again, it's harder to memorize when you're correcting work. And then finally, with the last summative assessment, them coming up with their own object and having to answer which senses we can and cannot use with it. Again, I think just memorization or copying are probably the biggest sources of bias that we can have with these kids. And eliminating that, and also making them show us that they understand the concept enough to apply it in new and novel ways, shows that they really understand, was what I was trying to do.
Well, and then because you recognized that in your lesson, and you knew that was a possibility, by allowing them to copy the two examples from you at the beginning, but then then having them give their own to at the end. So you obviously recognize that was a possibility. So I'd say outstanding because of that. And
also just to make sure that they understood what they were supposed to do with the worksheet.
Right.
It can be
that's
confusing.
It was right there.
So the first was just basically instructions. This is how to make sure everyone knew what we were doing. And then the next two can kind of show me that at least they understand the concept of what this worksheet is. But then the last one's proving that they understand the concept of the lesson.
Outstanding.
Great. And then the last one was where they're both formative and summative assessments to know whether students were learning. So I tried to keep a pretty good balance where I came back with a lot of constant formative assessments to make sure they were tracking what we were learning, or to show me what we had learned previously, like with the pre-assessments. And then tried to keep the summative assessments as really focusing on the concept.
Right.
So formative assessments kind of showing that they're tracking every step we're taking, but then the summative being, it's up to you to show me that this isn't just parroting vocabulary and sentences.
Right. You did a number of times, didn't you?
But I didn't really document. That was, I think that was...
Document, what would that be? The paper?
Probably like keeping track as we were going of how kids were doing. I think I keep track of it in my head. If say a kid, when we're going over vocabulary, was having trouble, I'll make it a point to go back to that kid frequently until they're doing a better job with it during those assessments. But I never really kept track of which kids seemed like they understood it very well, they understood it moderately, or if they were struggling. So I could have documented it.
Now, on the other hand, because we know our class sizes makes it much more easy to have that personal understanding of each child without having to...
And I think it's what we do every day, so you just get used to just keeping track in your mind, like, okay, he's got it, she's got it, he doesn't.
I guess, because of there was no documentation. I'd say proficient only because of that. There was you didn't mark anything out at that point. But you you do know individual children just because of the number of children we work with.
But it might not be a bad idea sometimes to also just have documentation for it. Great. All right, thank you.
Thank you.